Hey everyone. Today I want to do a little bit more of an in-depth look at one particular study Bible that some of you may be interested in, especially if you are a Methodist or a Wesleyan, whether you're in the United Methodist or Methodist Church, the Church of the Nazarene, the Wesleyan Church, or maybe you're an Anglican and you want to get a study Bible with a Wesley, John Charles Wesley connection. This is the one to get. This is the Wesley Study Bible. See if I can get where you can see that. In the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, and as you see, it's published by Abingdon Press. This is the first edition of the New Revised Standard Version, and what I'm going to talk about in this video is, first of all, just the editions and kind of what you get, the quality of the binding and everything. I'm going to talk about the features, and then I'm going to talk about the translation. The Wesley Study Bible is available in another translation. That's the Common English Bible, the CEB, and if you've watched my videos, you know that is not a translation that I really like, and so it's not one that I'm going to recommend. I don't think it's a particularly great translation. Though every translation, of course, has its strengths and its drawbacks, and we'll talk about that with this translation as well. So, this is the Wesley Study Bible. This is the first NRSV edition, and it has this sort of tan and green, what is it called, leather soft, true tone. Different companies use different label for what you call this, but it's a cover that looks and feels like leather when it's new, but it does particularly on the edges and along the edges here, you can see it does tend to crack and everything over time. So that's not a super strong or durable cover, though it does look nice, especially when it's new. Now, at the same time they released this leather soft or true tone cover, they did a limited release genuine leather edition, and you see that the binding kind of lines up. It looks the same. It's just instead of the faux leather, it is a genuine leather, and it's a pretty thick leather, and it feels pretty durable. Now this one I got used, and it did have some imperfections. I don't know if you can see that. There's kind of a bulging thing going on here and here. But for the most part, really nice. You see it says genuine leather. It feels like it's going to last a lot longer, and it's much more durable. But besides the cover, this one does have gold edge gilding on the pages and a different color ribbon, but besides that, they are exactly the same. It's the Wesley Study Bible, New Revised Standard Version. It has the little NRSV logo and everything from Abingdon Press. So these are pretty hard to come by. I actually got this on eBay and paid a pretty penny for it, but I'm glad I did. I think of all the editions that I have of the Wesley Study Bible, this is the one that I'm going to keep for the long haul. This one I'm donating to my church library, and I keep up at my office. But what you may not know, if you kind of are aware of the Wesley Study Bible, you may not know that they recently did a new edition. This is a bonded leather edition, and it has this sort of John Wesley signature thing, JW, on the front. And it's very difficult to read the spine, but there you see it's the Wesley Study Bible, New Revised Standard Version, and Abingdon. So pretty similar. It's not exactly the same spine details as the other. I really do wish this had gold or silver lettering so you could read it a lot easier. And it also has no edging on the pages. It's just white, and it has this sort of red salsa colored ribbon that looks really good with this kind of charcoal dark gray color. I think those look really good together, and I think silver lettering and silver page edging would look really good with it. This cover, I don't know if you can see this, it has these like white specks all over it, and I don't know if that's something, I haven't tried to like rub that off. It seems like there's little bits of paper or wrapping that have just kind of stuck to it, like lint or something, but maybe that's actually in the bonded leather. Now this cover is very thin. and it almost just feels like cardstock with a very thin leather layer over it. So I'm very curious to see how well this is going to hold up over time, but it certainly looks nicer, and I think it will probably hold up better than the fake leather, because it is at least bonded leather. There's some real leather in here. All three of these editions are exactly the same on the inside. I mean, every page is the same. And so we're going to look at the features next, and then talk last about the translation. So as a study Bible, what do you get with the Wesley Study Bible? I'm going to open this up to a couple of pages. Like all study Bibles, you got, of course, the scriptural text, and then at the bottom of the page in this one, you've got notes on the text, and one thing that I think, I'm going to talk about pros and cons of this Bible. One thing I think they could have done better, the notes are pretty big print, which is nice and easy to read, but it means there's just not as much there. And they do, at the end of every book, there's just a lot of white space, and I'm like, you guys could have squeezed some more in there, especially considering that the notes are often not even on the same page as the text that they're referring to. It's usually on the same page, but sometimes it's like a page turnover, so why not go a little longer and get more in there? So you've got the standard kind of study Bible notes at the bottom of the page. Here you can see some here in the Gospel of Matthew. The other thing that you get is these little boxes that say Life Application Topic, and this one is Always Pray. And we're looking at 2 Thessalonians, so you're like, well, what's that connect with, you know? So you don't always see really explicitly what, why is it on this page, but usually there is a reason. It has something to do with the text up in here, and if you read the whole page, you'll figure out why this is here. But the life application topics, as the name implies, are just really practical things. Usually, this is the Wesley Study Bible, so they talk about ways that John Wesley practiced, or ways the early Methodists practiced, in this case prayer, and so you can check that out. And then they also have these other boxes that look slightly different, that have Wesleyan core terms, and on this page there happens to be two of them, justifying grace and mission. And these are really good, just succinct introductions to major Wesleyan theological ideas. And again, there's usually some reason why it's on this page, or why it's connected with this particular book or this letter, although it's not always teased out very explicitly, so you kind of have to connect the dots a little bit. These boxes, the life application and the Wesley core terms, those are the main kind of special features of this Bible, really. And for the most part, they're really good. There are some of these that are written where they use lots of abbreviations and shorthand, or they seem to assume that the reader already knows like a lot of jargon and terminology. So some of them, I think, are not as clear as they could be, but for the most part, they're pretty good. And there's not, in terms of other features, there's really not much else. There's the notes at the bottom of the page. There are no cross-references, although they do usually do a good job if the New Testament is alluding to an Old Testament or quoting an Old Testament passage. They'll usually quote it in the notes. If there's a similar theme that you've already run across, they'll often note that in the notes, go back and look at, chapter 1, verse 2. It also talks about this. But there's no real cross-referencing. Let me pull out another Bible and kind of compare it for you. This is the NIV Study Bible. It has a aftermarket cover on it, but it's this is an older edition that I've had for 20 years, but this is a very kind of standard American evangelical Protestant type study Bible. You've got cross references in a center column for just about every verse. There's going to be a connection to other verses in other parts of the Bible. And then you've got notes at the bottom of the page that have much smaller print. I don't know if you can tell the difference there. So there are just more notes on every page. And so there's just more detail. And this also has a lot of other things, charts, maps, illustrations that you do not get with the Wesley Study Bible. Of course, a lot of newer, like here's a depiction of the old city of Jerusalem at the time of the Gospels. and shows where certain significant events happened. You just don't have anything like that with the Wesley Study Bible. Now, you do have a pretty good selection of maps in the back, and that's where you do get kind of the layout of the city of Jerusalem at different ages in Israel's history. And then there's no index, there's no concordance, there's no, like you have in this, again, the NIV Study Bible, you've got a concordance to look up individual words, and there are concordances available for the New Revised Standard Version, so I really wish they had put that in there. That seems like that would have been an easy thing to do, and that would, enhance the usefulness of that Bible. There's also, in this NIV Study Bible, you have an index to subjects, so if you want to look up everywhere the Bible talks about generosity, there's a bunch of subjects. You don't have anything like that for the Wesley Study Bible. What you do have that is useful is you've got the life application topics and the Wesley core terms, and they're available both in alphabetical order, which is probably going to be the most handy, as well as in biblical order. So all the ones in Genesis are listed, and then Exodus. So if you wanted to look up a topic or a subject, you could certainly flip over to this page. So in this case, if we wanted to look up, grace, there's a big important one. You could go to that page, you could read the box, and then read the scriptures that it's kind of correlated with and why it's on that page. So, that does kind of serve as a topical index, but it certainly is pretty minimal compared to what you get in other study Bibles. So, so that's what you get. There are also book introductions. That's really the only other thing you get in here is book introductions, and they're pretty minimal. And when I first got this Bible, I kind of complained about, man, these book introductions, they're so short. They do often tell you what John Wesley used these things for, or things he said about the book, but they're pretty short. Now, I will say the more I've been working lately with like 3 or 4 study Bibles on my desk, and I want to read an introduction, a short one actually turns out to be a little bit of a virtue, because if it was 5 pages and I wanted to read 4 of them, well, that's a lot of reading. I wish that they did have kind of just a snapshot, as some Bibles do, like author, date, audience, themes, kind of thing, and just to give you a very quick overview at a glance, that would be nice. I think cross-references would add a lot to this Bible, and I think it would also benefit from some essays about Wesleyan theology, Wesleyan spirituality, and how John Wesley and Charles Wesley approached the Bible. What was their understanding of biblical authority? How did they interpret the Bible? So those would be nice additions if they ever do a new edition of the Wesley Study Bible. But on the whole, I would say this is one of the nicer study Bibles available in the New Revised Standard Version. A lot of the study Bibles for the NRSV that I'm aware of, anyway, they tend to be they're designed for like a secular academic setting. And so they're not often, or not always anyway, reflective of the faith of the church. So they may have more skeptical, in the notes, more skeptical attitudes toward miracles, toward the authority of Scripture. And so I think that is one of the things that makes this one of the better New Revised Standard study Bibles you can get. And because it's from a Wesleyan point of view, which is, as I see it, the best point of view for reading the Bible, that also makes it a great study Bible. The notes and the perspective, it is a little uneven, and there are different editors and commentators for different books of the Bible, and some of them do have more kind of a sort of scholarly, academic, maybe slightly skeptical at times point of view, and some of them have more of kind of a warm heart, devotional, evangelical kind of view. And so from book to book, it's a little uneven, I think. I think it would have benefited from a little bit more smoothing out some of that stuff. I will say, though, whereas most, and here's a positive about this Bible, whereas most study Bibles, like I said, the NIV Study Bible is a great example, tend to default to kind of a Southern Baptist view of the sacraments. They're not going to, even acknowledge that infant baptism might be a thing, or that Christ and his body and blood might somehow really be present in the Lord's Supper. This study Bible, while it doesn't go into great detail, it does at least kind of acknowledge and own the traditional view that's shared by Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Catholics, Orthodox, basically all of Christianity for most of the history of the church. So that's a good thing about this study Bible. The final thing I want to mention about this new edition of the Wesley Study Bible is that like the tan and green faux leather edition and the genuine leather edition that was sort of a limited edition, it is New Revised Standard Version of the Wesley Study Bible. And as I said, there are a number of New Revised Standard Version study Bibles that are really, I think, kind of intended for sort of an academic environment, like a secular academic environment. And they have a lot of sort of historical, critical interpretation in the notes. There are not as many study Bibles in the New Revised Standard translation that really have more of a kind of more conventional theological approach to interpreting in light of the historic teachings of the church. And what the Wesley Study Bible does is it tries to, as the name implies, bring together the insights of John Wesley. There are a lot of quotes from Wesley, quotes from Wesley's notes on the Bible, occasionally quotes or allusions to a sermon, so that's really good. Bringing the tradition of the church as well as some of the insights of historical critical scholarship, kind of bringing all that together in one study Bible. And I think that is really a valuable thing, though as I've said, that can lead it to feel a little bit uneven at times. But the New Revised Standard Version is a really solid translation. It does have some deficiencies, certainly, but every Bible translation, as I've said, has its pros and its cons. And the New Revised Standard Version, along with the English Standard Version, here's an English Standard Version, are the two that I use the most. They're the two that I almost always am preaching from, usually the NRSV, sometimes the ESV if I think it's got a better rendering, or sometimes a more beautiful rendering. But for the most part, those are the ones I'm preaching from, and they're extremely similar. And they're based, both of them, on the RSV, Revised Standard Version. And the main differences, I would say, is that the English Standard Version reflects sort of conservative evangelical scholarship, and the main thing they were trying to do was be as literal as possible, interpreting the original Greek and Hebrew words in that kind of Bible tradition, English Bible tradition that goes back to the King James Version. And that's why I think the English Standard Version has become very popular in the last 20 years or so since it came out. The New Revised Standard Version also is in that same lineage or tradition, going back to the RSV and before to the KJV, the King James Version. But the New Revised Standard Version does have a little bit of a looser translation at times, particularly because they were trying to introduce in this translation gender-neutral language when it comes to passages that speak about human beings, whereas in the original language it's often in the singular, and a person was walking down a hill and he did this and he did that. That's how most people throughout history have spoken. They'll use the masculine in an inclusive or generic sense. But in our language today, in large part because of the influence of kind of feminism on education, a lot of people, particularly younger people, like people my age and younger, don't really talk like that. And we do tend to use the plural pronoun they in order to avoid using gendered language. And the New Revised Standard Version actually does that in a lot of its translation. Not everywhere, but for the most part, when there's a masculine inclusive in the original language, they'll change it to plural or they'll reword it so as to avoid using gendered language. And so, and we'll look at Psalm 1 in a moment in these two translations, and you can kind of see the difference. And, I think some people have complained that it's just a liberal translation, but I think there is a really a good case to make that this is the way people, for the most part, talk in contemporary English, and the whole purpose of translation is to take a text in a foreign tongue and bring it into the way people talk now so that people can understand it. And so I think there is a good rationale for using gender-neutral language as much as possible. And even the English Standard Version actually does use more gender-neutral language than the Revised Standard and the King James versions that came before. It just doesn't go nearly as far as the New Revised Standard Version. So even they kind of, I think, these translators of the English Standard Version kind of admit that. The problems with the NRSV, for the most part, I think, have to do with that same thing. So I think there's a good case to be made for using gender-neutral language. However, it does come with some drawbacks. And one of those you can see here in Psalm 1. So the New Revised Standard, well, let me start with the English Standard Version. It's more accurate to the original Hebrew. It says, this is Psalm 1, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord." Whereas the New Revised Standard Version changes it to the plural to avoid using the masculine pronouns. And so it says, "Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord." So if we take this in Psalm 1 as kind of an inclusive, sort of generic, any person who does these things is blessed, then the New Revised Standard Version's translation is actually more clear in communicating that to the modern English speaker, especially in America, even more clear in communicating that than the English Standard Version. However, and this often happens with the New Revised Standard Version, there is another layer of meaning that you miss because there is also a messianic reading or interpretation of Psalm 1. Who is the blessed man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, but his delight is in the law of the Lord? It's Jesus, the Messiah. He is the one who fulfills this passage. He's the one who is the truly blessed man. He's the true man, the new Adam. And so that messianic reading becomes obscured when you change it to the plural, and it becomes harder to see. And this is one reason why I think you should always be comparing two Bible translations, at least two, whenever you're seriously studying Scripture. And if you are in a Bible study group and different people have different translations, get different people to read the passage that you're studying. I think that's a valuable thing. So there are times when messianic interpretations of Old Testament passages can become obscured, and there are times in which New Testament allusions to the Old Testament also get obscured by the gender-neutral language. Another great example is in the book of Daniel, chapter 7. If you've read the Gospels at all, you know that Jesus, in most English translations, he refers to himself rather cryptically as the Son of Man. What does that mean? Well, it's actually a quotation from Daniel chapter 7, this vision, where Daniel says in verse 13, it says, "I saw one like a human being," and then there's a footnote at the bottom of the page, and it tells you, another translation is, "I saw one like a son of man." I saw one like a human being / son of man coming down with the clouds of heaven. Jesus, whenever he calls himself the Son of Man, he's actually applying this prophetic vision to himself, but because the NRSV translates it neutrally as a human being, you can actually miss a huge hint that Jesus is dropping about just who he is. So that's a potential drawback to the New Revised Standard Version. And there are a few places where, in their attempts to avoid masculine pronouns or masculine language, they just end up creating some awkward and kind of ugly English sentences. Although for the most part, this translation is quite nice to listen to because it does still kind of have some of the cadence of the King James Version. So those are some, potential pros and cons to how this translation kind of approaches the text. It is mostly a very literal translation like the English Standard Version. In fact, I would imagine that just from reading them in parallel, maybe 70 to 80% of the entire text is exactly word for word the same, or very nearly word for word the same. So they're very similar translations in their philosophy and in how they sound. The New Revised Standard Version, when I was in seminary, was the go-to translation for Methodists, and I'm sure that's why the Wesley Study Bible is in the NRSV. Just some thoughts on that. But again, it is the translation I tend to preach from, and it's a good translation to read devotionally, to memorize, and to listen to the Word of God with. So those are my thoughts on the Wesley Study Bible. It's now out in a new bonded leather edition that you can pick up at cokesbury.com, christianbook.com, and I'm sure other online web sellers. So yeah, hope you guys like this video. Feel free to share it, and if you have questions about this study Bible, feel free to drop them in the comments.